Hi, I'm Deb Miller. I'm the director of the Public Management Center at the University of Kansas. I'm pleased to introduce this webinar series. We've missed engaging with you live and in person. Who knew something so common could now feel so precious and valued? Though not live and in person, we hope these webinars will provide you with a convenient outlet to continue learning, and in this now daily virtual way, connecting with other public sector professionals. Because they are pre-recorded, you can view the webinars as your schedule allows, share them with others if you choose, and listen to key points more than once. Each of our speakers is offered to make themselves available to answer your questions. If you have questions, please leave them in the chat or in the comments below. We will either connect you with the presenter or respond to you with an answer. Here at the PMC, we believe that public service lies at the heart of democracy. During these strange, uncertain times, you are doing democracy in ways you never imagined and finding workarounds you never expected to need. We salute you and hope that in some small way, we can support and assist you in your work.
Bonnie Johnson is an associate professor in the University of Kansas Urban Planning program. She teaches planning history and theory, land use, and politics and planning courses. Research interests include civic bureaucracy, staff reports, television and citizen participation, and planners working with city managers. Before returning to school for her doctorate, Johnson was a practicing city planner for 8 years. While at the City of Liberty, Missouri, she was a project manager for Liberty's Blueprint for Liberty Land Use Plan, which was awarded the American Planning Association's Outstanding Planning Award for Best Plan in the country. She is currently the Professional Development Officer for the Kansas chapter of APA, and her work on staff reports can be found in APA's Planning Magazine and Signature Series webinar, Preparing for Planning Commission Meetings.
Hi, today we're going to talk about not your grandfather's zoning. Or is it? Have things changed that much? Well, let's take a look back at zoning and what's happening today and see where we're at. So maybe you're thinking about what makes a great place. You've been hanging around home a lot lately, and you may be wondering, is this really such a great place? Well, let's check our tool shed. What's in our tool shed that will help make a great place? Well, for our communities, the big tool we have is zoning. So we've got zoning, we've got subdivision regulations in our tool shed, we've got site plan guidelines, we've got engineering standards, and we've got utility plans. All of these regulations together create the places where we live. But we may be thinking, well, what can we do about the main tool that we use, which is zoning? And maybe there's some things going on with it that we could do differently and that we could maybe help make better places. So let's take a look. We're going to start with taking a look back at zoning because what it is today has a lot to do with where it began. We're going to look at what does the typical zoning set of regulations get us in terms of place. Then we're going to look at some add-ons, how zoning has been changed or other tools that get combined with it that create place. We're going to look at what's new in zoning. So the first thing to think about is, and here's some questions for you to ask yourself. What does the community want their place to be like? Then ask yourself, are our current zoning requirements getting us there? Is what we're doing currently with our regulations, particularly with zoning, getting us the kind of community we want? If not, what is our community willing to ask for? Regulations like zoning can be very powerful, and they can get you the kind of community you want, but you need to know what that is, and you have to think about, well, how hard am I willing to push this? How much am I willing to ask for and to require? And what am I willing to say yes to, and what am I willing to say no to? And that gets us to think about what all is going on in the background with zoning. So I've gone all the way back to 1926 for the first standard state zoning enabling act that was put together by the Department of Commerce. And you might see up here, Herbert Hoover was the secretary of the Department of Commerce that put together the state enabling legislation that went out and became the foundation for all of zoning that many local communities have today. So this was model legislation that was put out there. States then picked it up, and then cities started picking it up. So I thought, let's go look at what it says about what zoning is. And so it says it's for the purpose of promoting health, safety, morals, or the general welfare of the community. The legislative body of cities and incorporated villages is hereby empowered to regulate and restrict the height, number of stories, and size of buildings and their structures, the percentage of lot that may be occupied, the size of yards, courts, and other open spaces, the density of population, and the location and use of buildings, structures, and land for trade, industry, residence, or other purposes. So there's actually a lot in there that communities can do to create the kind of place they want to see. But zoning in particular has become limited to use, the use of building structures and land for trade, industry, residence, or other purposes. Actually, I wanted to point out in this state enabling legislation, there's a little note here, note number 1, by health, and they say that they deliberately left off public in front of health. They didn't want things limited to just public health. They wanted it to be that there are things that it's just healthy for an individual, and they wanted these regulations to take that into consideration. I think that's very interesting considering our times in the middle of a pandemic and our discussions about individual health and public health. So they deliberately left public off so that it was very inclusive. So there's the origins of zoning. So let's take a look back at zoning. Codes have been around a long time, even in the US. Colonial Williamsburg, which people visit today and love, and it's this tourist attraction, it didn't just happen willy-nilly. There were codes. Those buildings all nicely lined up, and their windows on the street, and where everything is located, they had a code that laid out how the town would be. And it created this place that people even love today, and we like to go visit. So codes have been around for a long time, even in the US. Cities were awful places. In the late 1800s, when people started moving from the countryside into cities, cities became incredibly overcrowded. They were unsafe, unhealthy, dirty, just not the greatest places to live. And this is a photo from early days of Chicago. So there was the idea that we need to get this under control. How can we create a better place for people to live? And we started trying to figure out zoning. Also part of zoning is a uniquely American sort of conflict that goes all the way back to Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. Perhaps you've gotten to see the musical Hamilton. You know, Jefferson and Hamilton did not always get along. Well, one thing they didn't get along about was that Jefferson thought that the foundation for the US should be the farmer, and the farm should be the basic unit. And he really didn't think that cities were good places for people to live. He thought, oh, they're good for the arts and culture, but really they're not good places for people to live. Hamilton, on the other hand, saw cities as these great generators of wealth and entrepreneurship and ideas and very vibrant places. And so Hamilton was a city guy, Jefferson was a country guy, and they didn't get along. And that history of the US is in the background of zoning as well. How do we reconcile city and country? How do we satisfy the Jeffersons and the Hamiltonians? How do we do this? And zoning tries to do that, but it's difficult. Zoning also has done a really good job of feeding into our worst natures. Racism, classism, being anti-immigrant. Zoning has furthered those. In the 1900s, cities, particularly in the South, passed racial zoning. So by block, there were different zoning districts that were divided by race. In 1917, the US Supreme Court, in the case of Buchanan versus Worley, struck down racial zoning, but that didn't stop the use of zoning to divide people, particularly by race and by class. Once those racial zoning districts were struck down, we saw the rise of single-use zoning districts, particularly single-family residential zoning districts, where you had to have a large plot of land and a large house on that land. In large portions of cities were zoned for that. And that was to continue racial segregation and to continue segregation by class. You had to have wealth and money to be able to live in those single family residential districts. And large areas were zoned that just simply to continue this racial segregation and also class segregation. Zoning also has the history of being anti-immigrant. The earliest zoning in San Francisco in the 1800s was to zone Chinese laundries out of particular areas. So that is underneath the surface of zoning, and we have to recognize that that's going on, that is how the tool has been misused, and we need to understand that to then use it for our better natures as we go forward in history. Related to the notion of single family zoning districts being only for the wealthy or the well-off, it is about the creation of wealth. The single family zoning districts in particular, that can be someone's largest investment. And if that house doesn't go up in value, that person could be risking their own future ability to get by. And so this gets wrapped up into property rights, and that I've invested in this piece of property. I intend for that investment to pay off at some point. And that's all wrapped up into zoning as well. And we have that zoning is trying to balance individual rights and community rights. So gosh, we are asking a lot of this tool, and it might not always be able to deliver. And then this thing called the automobile started to show up. And just as maybe we were starting to figure out zoning and make kind of these interesting cities with civic centers and beautiful parks
and streetcars. This thing called the automobile shows up, and boy, those things are so cool. And it's going to mess up all of our lovely zoning that we've tried to put in place to create these tight-knit communities that aren't sprawled all over the place. So those automobiles are going to throw a monkey wrench into our zoning as well. So you talk about zoning, there's a lot going on under the surface. So the typical zoning, what do we get? So the zoning that is predominant today in the US really can be traced back to what was popularized after World War II, and that is use-based zoning. And this is an example of a use-based zoning code. This is from Amarillo, Texas. And you can see that it's laying out in a table. I've got an agriculture district. What's allowed there? Well, looks like a one-family housing unit is allowed there. The multifamily district 2 allows for a bed and breakfast inn and group living quarters. So they're really just lists of uses and what districts those different uses can go in. So remember all that background noise going on behind zoning? It's a lot of people arguing over what should happen in their communities. My property, no, my community's rights. You can't touch me. Stop touching me. Mom, Dad, they're touching me. That's all going on in the background. And so zoning was like, well, we've got these lists of uses. Why don't we just separate them just to try to keep the peace? And so we get separate zones for different uses. None of this mixing things up, because then that just creates arguments. So let's just separate them and we're all going to be happy. So zoning kind of became this use-based zoning, and having these different districts became a mechanism for stopping the arguments. I mean, it was just a way of avoiding conflict. But when you're avoiding that conflict and you're separating these land uses, what do you get? Well, after the 1940s, we get suburbs, and we get the suburban model. And that's what this zoning by separation is going to get us. So remember our question about, well, what kind of place does your community want to be? If they want to be suburbia and have everybody be separate, boy, the traditional zoning district, you really can't do any better than that. It's going to get you suburbia. It's going to separate those land uses. It's going to make areas where there's only one type of land use, so minimizing those arguments. It's going to have large setbacks from roads. You're going to drive a lot, so yay, automobile. We love our automobiles. Got to have a place to put those cars. We've got large parking lots. We're going to have access management issues, which is a fancy way of saying you're going to have a lot of roads with driveways on it, and those driveways are going to create conflicts, and it's going to slow down traffic and all of that. And then we're going to have issues with extending utilities, because if we separate everybody, I've got to run those sewer lines out far and those water lines out far. So you know, zoning traditionally from the 1940s, if you like suburbia, that's what you're going to get. And it's a separation of land uses on the large scale and small scale. So large scale across town, we're putting the industry way outside of town, keeping residential and commercial separate. It's even on the smaller scale, where even this is all commercial, but each one of these commercial uses has its own driveway. They're not, you know, don't touch me, don't touch me. They're all each individually separated as well. And this is my illustration of the ultimate separation: commercial area, grocery store. This is a movie theater. And look, don't touch me. There's a fence in between the two, and barbed wire on the top. So boy, you grocery store shoppers, don't come over to my movie place, and movie place, don't go over to those groceries. Don't want to touch each other. One thing that helps mitigate some of this separation and to make suburbia not so bad is a thing called transitioning. And that's where at the busy corner, you start off with highway commercial. Then next to it, you have commercial and offices, some more offices. Hey, a hotel. Then you get apartments, townhomes, duplexes, then single family homes. And this is called step down zoning or transitioning. And thus, somebody that lives in an apartment here, they could walk over here to the convenience store at the corner. They could also walk over to the grocery store. And so they're still separated, but they transition gradually. But to get this, you have to ask for it. And that's where we run into trouble with use zoning, is it gets hard to ask for this transitioning when the property owner for this hotel says, well, I don't want to do a hotel. I want to do single family residential. It gets hard for communities to say no because of that conflict between community rights and property rights. And you end up with things like this, single family homes right next to industrial. Well, we try, and when we can't get transitioning to work, we try to buffer things. We have trees or open space. We have a road, landscaping, just distance, a fence, backing up different uses to each other. Again, backing up different uses. Heaven forbid that these duplexes here should touch these townhomes over here. Landscaping and berms, so we can buffer things. And it's that separation is getting even down to very fine grain. You can use alleys if you have alleys. But we come back to, well, what does the community want their place to be like? If you want suburbia, great, use-based zoning is going to get you there. But it can go really bad if you're not willing to ask for the transitioning. So, you know, you might start thinking, well, can we do something different? There are add-ons. So I'm not going to go through all of this list, but we've tinkered with zoning to try and get this to work, to deal with all that stuff in the background. Things that you're very familiar with, special use permits, performance regulations, where we've said, hey, if the noise doesn't get beyond the property line, I don't care what you're doing over there. Planned unit developments, design guidelines. Well, let's at least make it look better. Queuing of development. You can say, why, sure, you can build that shopping center as soon as we have a market for it. Inclusionary housing, green belts. All of these things are tools we have in our toolkits that go along with zoning. I talk about with planning students about that whenever a community wants to do something different, one thing you can do is check the garbage can. There have been tons of ideas about how to do zoning, how to create great places. And those ideas sometimes get picked up, but a lot of times they just get thrown into the garbage can. Now, this garbage can doesn't ever get emptied. So anytime you need a good idea and you don't know where to begin, start with the garbage can. And so this is a model, a theory this is how the sausage gets made, so to speak, politically, is people start going and looking through the trash cans to look for some good ideas that got thrown away. All of these add-ins are in that garbage can. So if you're looking for something new, go look in the garbage can, see what's there. ready to help you out. So what's new-ish? Planners have turned to sustainability as a way of trying to deal with all of those background issues that make zoning so messy. It's if we could only get people to agree to balance livability, equity, ecology, and economy, everything's going to be all right. And we're going to feel good, and we're going to get to the heart of things, and everybody's going to be happy. We're all going to be in our get along shirt. So sustainability is our get along shirt. And so we've kind of looked at some of our tools to see, well, how can we get sustainability? Lots of things are out there. All of these are in the garbage can. So go look. Zoning that allows for wind and solar energy, eco-industrial zones, cooperative housing, secondary dwelling units, which are things that are often called mother-in-law units or granny flats, where you have a rental unit in your backyard, grocery stores in residential areas, parking maximums. Don't build that big giant parking lot that's not used all the time, and also allowing urban agriculture. So those are newish things that go along with trying to pursue sustainability. Very new is eliminating single-family zoning districts. Minneapolis has done this, and they have ended single-family zoning districts. So remember that history with single-family zoning districts, that it was about racism and classism and about creation of wealth, and that if you are part of a group like African Americans that have been left out of the ability to invest in and buy a home, you haven't been able to create that wealth that white Americans have been able to do. And so maybe it's time to get rid of single family zoning. And Minneapolis has been able to do that. And how they did that is, one thing they did is they started with secondary dwelling units, allowing them. The world didn't come to an end with people having granny flats in their backyards. And so then they gradually worked up to, well, let's do away with exclusively single family zoning. And that has made for a lot more housing choices and affordability. Now, if you get a little scared about the idea of getting rid of single family zoning, just think about how much single family zoning is out there. Even Los Angeles, 70% is single family zones. Seattle, Washington, 80%. So there's a lot out there. And there are places where you can mix housing styles and the world doesn't come to an end. And it allows for a lot more affordable housing. So very new, get rid of exclusively single family zoning. A new form of zoning, form-based codes. They've been around for a while, but they're just now kind of catching on. Remember that 1926 definition of zoning where it talks about the percentage of the lot, the size of yards, the buildings, the structures, open space. They're enabling things that are called form-based codes where we're doing more than just use. So the definition of a form-based code is a land development regulation that fosters predictable built results in a high-quality public realm by using physical form rather than separation of uses as the organizing principle for the code. A form-based code is a regulation, not a mere guideline, adopted into city, town, or county law. A form-based code offers a powerful alternative to conventional zoning regulation. So, this isn't the traditional use-based zoning. It's influencing the form or the built environment itself. They are becoming more popular. This is a chart of by state and then also different countries around the world that have adopted form-based codes. And this is as of early 2019 is when this table was put together. And so you can see Florida has 72 communities that have form-based codes. Missouri has 10, Kansas has 4, North Carolina has 27, Texas has 49. So this type of zoning regulation is picking up steam. So what is it really all about? It starts with the Transect. It's understanding that cities aren't monoliths and that there are different types of areas, all the way from the urban core out to a natural zone around cities. And so how do you get these different little areas in your city? The main elements of a form-based code is that there's a regulating plan. And this is more than just uses. It's what the actual types of buildings, where they're going to go. And you're going to have public standards. What are our standards for sidewalks, for on-street parking, street trees? What is this public realm going to look like? And then building standards. What are those private individuals going to do in building buildings? What are they going to look like and what are they going to be like? So I went and looked at a form-based code. This one is in Virginia. And one thing they did is they ended up with 3 districts: a gateway district, a town district, and a residential district. So think about maybe your community and the 10, 12, 20 zoning districts you have. Here, they've gone down to 3. And so let's look at what goes into each one of those districts. So the neighborhood district in the town area, you're going to get a mixture of uses and buildings that look like this. The gateway is going to look like this. And then the residential area is going to look like this. And so it's not only talking about use, it's what the buildings are going to look like and how they relate to the street. So in the town district, here's our lot width, lot shape, the setback lines, the location, curb cuts, those driveways, distance from intersections, and here's what this is going to look like. If we then look at the building form, so they're going to even get into the details of where the door is and windows and where the parking's going to go, very detailed. And here's our parking spaces and having shared parking. And so you can see where this is very different from that use zoning. Here's our uses. Again, by town, gateway, residential areas. And then in a residential area, how are those houses arranged around a courtyard? Things like that. So, form-based codes, not your grandfather's zoning, or is it? Well, I did some looking back at zoning history, and apparently, originally, zoning for cities, and here's an example from Phoenix. In the 1930s, originally they only had 3 zones: industrial, business, and residential. And each of those had a mixture of uses in them. They weren't single use districts. And so it's very interesting that with form-based codes and mixed use districts, we're going back to the origins of zoning, which was actually very simple. And you had districts that had residential and commercial within them. It wasn't just single family homes. So maybe we are still doing our grandfather's zoning. It's just that back in the day, without the automobile, you had the distance someone could walk or the distance that someone could take a streetcar that influenced the form of cities. And now we don't have that so much because of the automobile. So with form-based codes, they're trying to put back into regulations those things that happened naturally before the automobile. So remember those things that I started off with. If you're thinking that maybe I'm not getting the place I want, think about what you do want. Is your current zoning getting you there? But then also think, what are you willing to ask for? And then go check out the garbage can and see what you might find. You might find there's some good tools in there ready for you to pick up. Thanks.